Living with friction: the structural logic of the EU-India partnership in a fragmented world. Introduction: from aspirational alignment to managed reality. The contemporary EU-India relationship is no longer best understood through the language of convergence, shared values, or inevitable strategic alignment. Those frameworks belong to an earlier international system, one characterized by expanding globalization, predictable alliance structures, and a relatively stable rules-based order. The world has receded That world has receded. In its place stands a fragmented, securitized, and competitive global environment where interdependence itself has become a source of vulnerability. That brief Living with Friction, Three Anchors of the EU-India Partnership, published by the European Union Institute of Security Studies, captures this shift with unusual clarity. In its central claim is not that the EU and India are drifting apart, but that their partnership is being forced to evolve under conditions of permanent strategic misalignment. This misalignment is not accidental, temporary, or the result of diplomatic failure. It is structural, and the durability of the partnership depends on whether both sides can accept this reality and design cooperation mechanisms that function despite it. And today I'm going to be discussing that argument. Situation: the EU-India relationship within the broader transformation of global geopolitics, examining the sources of friction and analyzing why modular domain-specific cooperation has emerged as the only viable organizing principle for the partnership. The end of the old strategic comfort zone. A relationship shaped by strategic slacks. For much of the last 2 decades, EU-India relationships matured in an environment that allowed for strategic complacency. India's primary external anchor was the United States, whose rise as India's preferred strategic partner reduced the urgency of deep engagement with Europe. For the EU, the transatlantic relationship served as the ultimate security guarantee, allowing Brussels to treat India largely as a long-term opportunity rather than an immediate necessity. This configuration created strategic slack. Differences over trade, Russia, development policy, regulatory philosophy could be postponed or compartmentalized. The EU-India Free Trade Agreement, launched in 2007, stalled repeatedly thereafter because a symbol of deterred ambition rather than failure. Political leaders could speak of untapped potential without being forced to confront the costs of misalignment. That slack has now disappeared. Systematic shocks and the collapse of strategic latitude. Three shocks have fundamentally altered the environment in which EU-India relations operate. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which transformed Europe's security outlook and redefined Russia from a problematic neighbor into an existential threat. The erosion of US reliability, accelerated by the return of Donald J. Trump to the White House, introducing uncertainty into Washington's commitment towards Europe and India. The weaponization of economic independence, as trade, technology, energy, and finance increasingly serve as instruments of coercion rather than neutral exchange. These developments did not push the EU and India into convergence. Instead, they exposed the depth of strategic divergence. Structural misalignment: different worlds, different logics. Divergent threats hierarchy. At the heart of Europe and India friction lies a simple but immovable fact: Europe and India inhabit different security universes. For Europe, Russia dominates the threat landscape. The war in Ukraine has forced long-term rearmament, deterrence planning, energy reconfiguration, the securitization of economic policy. For India, China is the pacing threat. Border confrontation, maritime pressure in the Indian Ocean, technological dependence, and Beijing's deep partnership with Pakistan shape New Delhi's strategic calculus. These are not variations of the same challenge. They generate different priorities, time horizons, and red lines. As long as China and Russia remain the primary threats to India and Europe, respectively, misalignment is not a diplomatic glitch, it is a baseless condition. Russia is the irreconcilable variable. Russia functions as a central axis of EU-India tensions because it sits at the intersection of this divergent perception. From EU's perspective, Russia is an aggressor state, Economic engagement is a security risk, and political neutrality is moral and strategic failure. From India's perspective, Russia is a legacy defense supplier, a hedge against Sino-centric regional consolidation, an energy partner critical to economic stability. India's continued imports of Russian oil and its refusal to politically isolate Moscow are often interpreted in Europe as opportunism or moral equivalence. In reality, they reflect cold strategic calculation. India's defense inventory remains heavily reliant on Russian origin systems. A sudden rupture would weaken, not strengthen, India's position vis-a-vis China. This is not alignment with Russia, it's a risk management under constraint. The illusion of values-based alignment. EU-India relations are frequently framed as a natural partnership grounded in shared democratic values. While both parties are formally democratic, this narrative obscures more than it explains. The current international system is not structured around value alignment, but around security, resilience, and control over the current systems. Normative convergence offers little guidance on the question of energy security, defense supply chains, semiconductor dependencies, maritime surveillance, industrial policy. The brief correctly reframes the relationship not as value convergence but as a parallel response to a shared pressure environment, one in which the rule based order is fraying and economic openness is increasingly conditional. Functional convergence, where cooperation actually works. If geopolitics exposes the limits of EU-India convergence, defense and technology reveals where cooperation remains viable. China as the silent convergence driver. China is the unspoken catalyst behind much of the functional cooperation between Brussels and New Delhi. Europe's exposure spans rare earth, clean technologies, batteries, and advanced manufacturing inputs. India's exposure is embedded in electronics, telecommunication, industrial components, and digital ecosystem. These dependencies are not theoretical. They translate strategic vulnerability. The result is not a shared China strategy but a converging incentive to reduce sensitive dependencies, from political alignment to operational cooperation. The most successful area of EU-India cooperation shares three characteristics. They are domain-specific, they blur civilian and military boundaries, they generate trust through repeated interaction, not declaration. Maritime domain awareness exemplifies this logic. Commercial shipping data, satellite imagery, port information, undersea monitoring serve both civilian and military purposes. Cooperation in this space allows practical collaboration without forcing political alignment on broader strategic questions. This cooperation is built on utility, not ideology. Defense cooperation without illusions. The limit of EU level defense integration. The brief is explicit about a critical constraint. Europe doesn't possess a unified defense industrial apparatus. Export controls, licensing regimes, and intra European competition prevent the emergence of a seamless EU wide defense partnership with India. As a result, depth exists primarily at a bilateral level, most notably with France, but also with Germany, Poland, and others. EU level initiatives play a contemporary role where institutional tools exist, but they do not replace national relationships. This fragmented architecture is not ideal, but it is realistic. Trust as practice, not principle. The evolution of defense cooperation illustrates a broader lesson. Trust emerges through doing. Joint projects, co-development narratives, interoperability exercises create habits of cooperation that political rhetoric cannot substitute. The EU-India relationship is learning to operate without illusions of unity. That paradoxically strengthens it. Trade and failure of the grand bargain. The FTA as a misplaced organization center for nearly 2 decades, the EU-India FTA has been treated as the litmus test of the partnership's success. This reflects as inherent This reflects an inherited worldwide in which comprehensive trade agreements served as anchors for strategic relationships. That worldwide no longer holds. India's approach, trade through a developmental sovereignty lens, initiatives such as Make in India and politically linked incentives are negotiating tactics. They are structural tools aimed at industrial upgrading and strategic autonomy. The EU, by contrast, continues to prioritize rules, standards, regulatory convergence. These logics collide. Climate mobility and regulatory friction. Climate policy and labor mobility highlights the depth of this mismatch. Instruments like carbon border adjustment mechanism are seen in Brussels as climate reality. In New Delhi, they are perceived as constraints on development. Mobility discussions are constrained by EU domestic politics, India concerns over skill recognition and retention. The problem is not a lack of ambition, it is the persistence of a model that no longer matches reality. Toward a modular partnership, the three anchors, the brief response, a reorientation of the EU India relationship around three functional anchors, geopolitics as management. Rather than pursuing alignment, the partnership should institutionalize mechanisms to manage disagreement, regular strategic dialogue, crisis consultation channels, and minilateral formats where threat perceptions overlap. Defense and technology as operational corridors. Maritime security, cyber resilience, space security, and undersea capabilities should be normalized and formalized as standings area of cooperation built around projects rather than declarations. Economics through security relevant domains. Critical minerals, clean technologies, semiconductors, digital ecosystems should be treated as pillars of cooperations in their own right, with trade agreements repositioned as instruments rather than foundations. Conclusion: coherence through friction. The EU India partnership is entering a phase of strategic adulthood. Its future will not be defined by rhetorical alignment or symbolic agreements, but by the capacity to function under persistent friction. Misalignment is not a weakness to be corrected, it is a condition to be managed. The partnerships that endure in the emerging international system will not be those that pretend unity exists, but those that engineer cooperation where interests overlap and insulate collaboration where they do not. In this sense, the EU India relationship is not failing, it is adapting. Whether that adaptation succeeds will depend on willingness of both sides to abandon comforting myths and build power where it actually matters.